We next have with us Leila Hessini. Leila currently serves as the Vice President of Programs for Global Fund for Women. Leila also currently serves on the board of Prospera, the International Network of Women's Funds, and is the Vice Chair for the Center for Constitutional Rights Board. Welcome, Leila. We next have with us Alejandra Burgos. Alejandra is a feminist activist and human rights defender. She works in the Feminist Collective for Local Development since 2012 and participates in the coordination of the Red Salvadoreña de Defensoras de Derechos Humanos. And in addition to all the amazing work she is doing, Alejandra is also a PhD candidate in the Ibero-American philosophy. Welcome, Alejandra. We next have with us Virginia Vargas Valente. Virginia is a Peruvian sociologist and a women's rights activist. She founded the Latin American division of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for New Era. Virginia was the recipient of a UNIFEM award during the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing in September 1995. She's an active participant in the Articulación Feminista Mercosur en América Latina, a Latin American feminist political network. We next have with us, welcome Virginia. We next have with us Kumudini Samuel. Kumi is a Sri Lankan feminist activist and is the co-founder of Women and Media Collective, a Colombo-based feminist group. She is also on the executive committee of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. She's also deeply involved in the coalition for assisting tsunami-affected women. Welcome, Kumi. We next have with us Dr. Tamika Peart. Dr. Peart is currently the youth representative on Gender Advisory Council of Jamaica and has also served as the coordinator of Bureau of Gender Affairs at the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Jamaica. Dr. Peart is currently the youngest member of the Jamaica Women's Political Caucus, a bipartisan organization that focuses on reducing the gender gap in political leadership in Jamaica. Welcome, Dr. Peart. And lastly, we have María Floridalma López Atz. María is a national youth and gender activist. She has worked extensively on the rights of indigenous peoples, women's rights, rights of children, adolescents, and youth. She has been part of the Guatemalan Parliament for Children and Adolescents from the age of 9. She is currently studying for her bachelor's in legal and social sciences, law, and notaries at the University of San Carlos de Guatemala, and is also the student of professional journalism at the University of San Carlos de Guatemala. Welcome, María, and once again, welcome to all the panelists. So our opening question for today, it has two parts. I would request the panelists to link the first and the second part. The question, given the diversity and dynamism of the feminist movements, what are the current opportunities and challenges facing the movements? Please highlight no more than 2 challenges and 2 opportunities. And the second part, what specific actions should key stakeholders, such as governments, private sectors, and international funds prioritize to support the work of feminist groups and organizations at various levels? For this question, I would like to invite María and Alejandra to go first, please, followed by Kumi and Virginia, and then Leila. And towards the end, I would like Minister Beckles Robinson and Dr. Peart to please respond. It would be great if Dr. Peart and Minister Beckles can incorporate some of the points raised by the panelists in their responses. Please note that each speaker has 4 minutes to respond to the first question. And in order to manage the time, I will be interrupting you at 3 minutes. So apologies for that in advance. So here we go with the first question, the challenges and opportunities that face feminist movements, and what are the key action points that various stakeholders should undertake to address these challenges? Thank you. Over to you, María and Alejandra first.
Bien, buenas noches. Perdonen que he tenido dificultades de conexión, pero bueno. Estoy desde El Salvador, desde el interior del país, y Soy representante de la Red Salvadoreña de Defensoras y en este espacio concretamente de la iniciativa mesoamericana. Creo que uno de los principales retos que enfrentamos en América Latina, pero concretamente en Mesoamérica, es el recrudecimiento de los estados de los estados autoritarios y de los procesos antidemocráticos. El uso de la fuerza por parte de los cuerpos uniformados, que hemos visto reflejado en lo que ha acontecido el pasado sábado, por ejemplo, en Tulum, en Quintana Roo, con una migrante salvadoreña, las caravanas migrantes, la situación de desigualdad estructural que se vive en la región mesoamericana, y sobre todo el recrudecimiento de los discursos antidemocráticos, de los discursos que se interponen en la defensa de derechos humanos de la población LGTBI, de las mujeres y de la población de mayor vulnerabilidad. Otro de los elementos tiene que ver con los procesos de remilitarización en Mesoamérica, así como proyectos extractivistas que conllevan una serie de dificultades para el movimiento feminista y para el movimiento LGTBI en la región. Y considero que estos son de los principales retos de América.
Thank you, Alejandra. Alejandra, would you like to address any key recommendations you have for international organizations, governments, funds to address some of these challenges?
Creo que una de las experiencias que ha sido fundamental, sobre todo lo hemos visto reflejado en estos últimos años, es el aportar y apostarle a la construcción de redes horas, de construcción de actividades que nos permitan acuerparnos, que nos permitan acompañarnos. También ejercer un espacio de contraloría e inclusión sobre los estados para la creación de sistemas de protección las mujeres defensoras y para los movimientos. Considero además que el generar la contraloría, el generar la incidencia, el generar estos procesos de presión sobre los estados antidemocráticos y esta mirada de vigilancia, esta mirada también desde el entorno internacional, estar pendientes, las redes de solidaridad internacional son fundamentales justamente para que la realidad en la cotidianidad del movimiento, de los movimientos en la región mesoamericana frente a los grupos de poder, frente a los poderes fácticos también a los que se enfrenta el movimiento. Creo que una de las principales, digamos, llamados, de las principales medidas a tomar es la generación de mecanismos de protección para mujeres defensoras, la necesidad de que existan espacios de debate, de diálogo con la sociedad civil. Creo que es una de las cosas fundamentales, saber escucharnos y saber entender que en el contexto en el que nos encontramos en la región mesoamericana es un contexto en el que estamos volviendo a enfrentar viejas prácticas de los 70s y de los 80s con la remilitarización, con procesos de discursos antidemocráticos y de libertad de expresión que están en este momento concreto en una situación de disputa. Entonces creo que eso es importante, que tanto los distintos estados como las organizaciones y los detonantes también puedan mirar la situación que está aconteciendo en la región y centrar también esa solidaridad y esa mirada de denuncia frente a las situaciones que enfrenta el movimiento feminista en la región mesoamericana. Nada menos el 7 de marzo, por ejemplo, en el caso de El Salvador, el gobierno envió un bus lleno de soldados armados a una marcha pacífica del movimiento feminista. Creemos que este discurso antifeminista que se ha propagado es importante que lo frenemos desde la perspectiva de una comunidad internacional sólida, del movimiento feminista internacional y que se pueda reconocer de la infinidad que los movimientos feministas han dado en la región de América Latina y el Caribe y alrededor del mundo. Cómo esto aporta a la construcción de la democracia y aporta también al abordaje de situaciones de violencia estructural como la desigualdad, como la...
Gracias, Alejandra. I will now hand over to María. María, 4 minutes, please, not more. Thank you.
Buenas noches a todas y todos. En mi idioma maya cachiquel, respecto a la pregunta, es claro cómo movimientos feministas o líderes feministas se enfrentan a una gran variedad de desafíos, pero creo que uno de los principales es la poca garantía y participación de las mujeres en los distintos espacios que hay. Creo que los principales es que las acciones de los movimientos feministas no son respaldados y es poca la organización entre activistas feministas entre países. Y otro gran desafío es que en la mayoría de países de la región aún no existe la paridad de género en cargos públicos, políticos y sociales, ya que no nos involucran en igualdad a las mujeres, sin importar que es el género más predominante en la mayoría de países. Aún así, no se ve reflejado en los distintos espacios de representación, menos aún con personas que tengan visión feminista, tampoco se involucra a personas de la comunidad LGBTIQ+, indígenas, afrodescendientes, personas del área rural, personas con discapacidad, sumándole que las participaciones políticas de niñas, adolescentes y jóvenes en espacios de toma de decisión es prácticamente nula, ya que la discriminación limita la representación de la diversidad con la que cuentan los países y no permite la participación exclusiva y liderazgo que pongan en primer plano a mujeres y jóvenes. Y en torno a las oportunidades, quiero hacer mención de algo muy importante, y es que los movimientos feministas jóvenes conciben las cosas de forma diferente, por lo que da oportunidad de modificar muchas cosas y de cambiarlas, pensando que desde nosotras se dan las oportunidades de cambio, ya que al estar en espacios como los movimientos feministas, permite que platiquemos entre nosotras sobre temas que nos afectan para luego hacer conexiones, viendo la problemática desde una forma integral y con el tiempo se traduce en cambios. Por ello, que la alianza entre las mujeres, entre colectivas y organizaciones son esenciales. La pandemia vino con muchas desventajas, pero algunas cosas positivas que podemos rescatar es que trajo consigo una oportunidad para los movimientos feministas, siendo esta la tecnología, además las redes, plataformas virtuales u otros medios que permitan crear espacios que se puedan aprovechar, como brindar la participación y espacios de formación y empoderamiento, utilizando redes para innovar los procesos como cursos de formación para tener generaciones más conscientes, informadas y una sociedad que se dé cuenta de los problemas como el patriarcado y el machismo. Y las acciones específicas que podía priorizar, aparte de las que ya se acaba de mencionar, primero a los gobiernos, que en lugar de tratar como unas delincuentes a las activistas por los derechos de las mujeres y criminalizar sus acciones como la libre expresión, deben de garantizar la participación efectiva, no solo de mujeres, sino de agendas feministas para implementar políticas públicas en beneficio de las mujeres, estableciendo espacios de diálogo entre gobierno y sociedad civil, asimismo garantizar el Estado laico. A los fondos internacionales, el de generar y garantizar más espacios de participación efectiva para la sociedad civil y las organizaciones de mujeres, niñas, adolescentes y jóvenes. Crear plataformas para mujeres que puedan tener ese espacio de conexión con más organizaciones feministas. Y al sector privado, pues brindar financiamiento a los movimientos sin imposición de agenda y con autonomía para ejercer el presupuesto. En resumen, asegurar que los movimientos y líderes feministas tengan los recursos y el apoyo necesario para seguir realizando y realizar las diversas acciones que aportan a la sociedad.
Gracias, María. Thank you so much. Kumudini, I invite you to go next. Challenges that the feminist movements are facing, along with opportunities, if you can think of any, and what are the key recommendations you would like to make to the various stakeholders? Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha, and good morning, everyone. As I speak from Colombo, and good evening to others across the globe. It's a privilege to be here at this Generation Equality Forum and this session on feminist movements. In the pre-Beijing period, pre-1995, feminist movements in South Asia, in this region, as well as in Sri Lanka, were autonomous and generally engaged in oppositional politics vis-a-vis the states. We theorized, organized, mobilized, and raised issues in public, often with critique of the state. Post-1995, With the establishment of women's ministries and government machinery on women and gender, we engaged with the state for legal and policy reform, kind of liberal feminist reformist politics rather than an oppositional politics. And we used the space, although at times there was also option and accommodation and sometimes compromise. This was a period in which we worked for greater democratization, and we won affirmative action to bring women into politics and other decision-making processes, a period of law reform and engagement with development policies, national action plans, and so on. Today, for South Asia, that space has rapidly closed down. We have illiberal and authoritarian regimes, populist politics, rising ultranationalism, and with it, an increasing conservatism against women, a narrow defined conception of the family, misogynist and stereotypical restrictions on women, women's sexuality, threats to bodily integrity, and serious threats to women's activism as frontline defenders of rights, with restrictions to freedom of expression, association, mobility, as well as the normalization of exceptional laws and policies, particularly now under the guise of responses to the pandemic. Heavy surveillance and an insupportable level of scrutiny and moral policing, including hate speech online, a phenomenon which was not known in 1995. We therefore need governments to respect human rights and norms, respect standards of necessity, proportionality, and temporality when introducing exceptional laws and policies, and to protect and respect human rights, especially the rights of women. We need governments to be accountable, and this is extremely important. This needs to be a priority for states, for UN entities, to ensure that states are held accountable. We need women's funds to support the courageous work undertaken by women as frontline mobilizers, advocates, and defenders of rights, and as feminists who use creative and innovative strategies and incorporate nuanced analysis to the practice of their activism. This is also extremely important. We see funding shrinking. We see funders being extremely cautious in the wake of state restrictions. And I think this is a moment in which that solidarity is absolutely essential for feminist mobilizing and activism. Since the crisis always spurs transformation and new forms of innovative response from feminists, this support is necessary. We also now see the phenomenon of public-private partnerships. We need the private sector to be careful not to be used politically and to work to support social transformation and the strengthening of democracy and democratic practice, and to understand how these restrictions can push back against we women have achieved over decades of struggle at local, national, regional, and global levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Over to you.
Muchas gracias, buenas noches. Muy contenta de estar con ustedes. Floridalma, hola, hace tiempo no te veo desde el año pasado. Bueno, voy por la primera, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son las oportunidades que enfrentamos en este momento? Creo que lo más interesante es, por lo menos en la región de América Latina, yo siento de que la capacidad de haber desarrollado un movimiento feminista, no solo referido a las negociaciones con el Estado, sino referido a tratar de construir una perspectiva interseccional, intercultural, reconociendo la enorme diversidad de formas de vida que tenemos en la región. Somos una región pluricultural, multiétnica, con diferentes cosmovisiones, la andina, la maya, muchas otras más, que en este momento hay todo un esfuerzo para que sean parte real del horizonte de cambio feminista. Creo que ese es el fuerte que tenemos en este momento. Pero claro, o sea, la fuerza de haber construido un movimiento que es plural y que es tremendamente diverso y con la conflictividad necesaria para poder avanzar. Sin embargo, creo que los retos son demasiado profundos, ya lo han estado diciendo las que me han antecedido. Creo de que uno de los retos fundamentales posiblemente sea el avance de los fundamentalismos, de los sectores conservadores, de los sectores no solamente conservadores contra las mujeres, sino de los sectores absolutamente conservadores con el desarrollo de la democracia. O sea, nuestros países tienen presidentes, tienen gobiernos que han militarizado generalmente la política y que no tienen ningún tipo de respeto por los derechos de la ciudadanía y por supuesto menos con las mujeres, ¿no? Basta ver lo que está pasando en este momento con dimensiones tan increíblemente fundamentales como lo que está pasando con los migrantes, por ejemplo, o lo que está pasando con Haití, o lo que está pasando en estos países que aparecen como más lejanos, ¿no? Entonces yo creo de que estos desafíos y la pandemia es evidentemente otro desafío. O sea, por un lado está el desafío de democracias de muy baja intensidad, democracias inconclusas que solamente están referidas a lo electoral y no a todas las transformaciones de la vida cotidiana. El avance, como les decía, de los fundamentalismos, pero sobre todo creo de que este convencimiento de que no podemos conquistar logros reales y permanentes si no logramos evidenciar la enorme contradicción entre el capital y la vida. Es decir, en este momento creo que se requiere un cambio mucho más profundo. Y bueno, no lo digo yo, que más o menos yo y muchas de las feministas lo hemos mantenido durante mucho tiempo, lo dice Alicia Bárcena, la directora de la CEPAL, que es el organismo de Naciones Unidas de América Latina. Ella dice claramente que es fundamental el cambio de un modelo económico que avanza por desposesión de cuerpos, tierras y territorios, que favorece una cultura de privilegio, que desactiva y coopta la democracia para servir mejor a sus intereses, que niega los sistemas de protección social y los regímenes de bienestar. Y necesitamos un Estado que no despolitice las agendas feministas como está pasando en este momento en muchos países, incluyendo, según dicen las compañeras recientemente, en este momento en México. Inusitadamente no se pensó que podía ser algo semejante, ¿no? O que evita incluso la integración regional tan importante para enfrentar dramas como la pandemia hoy en día, ¿no? Creo de que esta es una lucha que es absolutamente fundamental y es una lucha donde no estamos solas, ¿no? Creo de que en este momento
Thank you.
¿Ya me caigo?
Virginia, sorry,
The time is over. Sigo después en la segunda. Bueno, hasta ahí me quedo. Quedé a mitad, pero no importa. Gracias.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry.
No.
Leila, over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much. Oh, am I echoing or can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here, to be part of the Generation Equality Forum, and to be part of this distinguished panel, and to have you as well, Anisha, as our moderator. So it's really important to hear from civil society activists that really underscore the intersecting and multiple crises that we face. And it's important to get resources in the hands of those activists, women human rights defenders, and feminists. And I'm going to really point to the issues of funding. This is a moment that, as our other speakers have articulated, is a moment of incredible challenges, but also radical opportunities to think differently about how wealth is accumulated in the world and what redistribution of that wealth will look like. And so I'd like to highlight some opportunities and think about how we can move from crisis to real transformation. And so one is for funders who are part of this process, governments, private sector, private philanthropists, to really commit to putting more and better funding that is intentionally designed to redistribute wealth to autonomous women and feminist organizations and movements. And the time really is now. There is so much wealth that has been accumulated even under the COVID pandemic, and we need to redistribute that wealth. And at the same time, the latest OECD DAC report shows that feminist movements receive less than 1% of all gender-focused bilateral official development assistance aid. So said differently, 99% of gender-focused ODA does not go directly to feminist organizations and movements. We must do better. This is just unacceptable. And we have to, at the very minimum, increase that 1% to 5% over the next 3 years. And there's an opportunity to do that. A second opportunity is through the action coalitions to develop new partnerships and funding modalities. And we recommend to all the leaders of the action coalitions and the commitment makers to make sure that 50% of your funding commitments go directly to autonomous women, girls, and trans-led feminist organizations and movements. And there are all kinds of modalities to get that funding directly. For certain funders, it's hard to do. There are women's funds that exist. There are other intermediaries that center the leadership of movements. There's ways to get funding to the local level, and that needs to be a commitment as part of the Generation Equality Forum. A third opportunity is for funders really to embrace feminist funding principles. And that is part of what Kumi and others spoke about earlier. Feminist funding principles are about getting flexible, multi-year core funding to movements, to supporting some of the safety and security that other speakers spoke about, to supporting protection networks that are so important to the work that needs to be done, to ensuring that grants sizes are proportional to the transformational work that other speakers spoke about, that there's no free labor, that actually movements and organizations are funded for the work that they do. Another aspect of feminist funding principles is to remove onerous proposal reporting and policy requirements that often take away from the core work that needs to be done to imagine and implement a different world that really is grounded in feminist principles and gender justice. Ensuring language justice and access to people with all varying forms of abilities is critical to this world that we want to create. To engage in trust-based and inclusive processes that include the communities most impacted by the harm in decision-making about how resources are allocated. These are ways and opportunities that I think exist, and I'll stop here, Anisha, to really make a change in how we resource and show solidarity with feminist movements across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila. I would like to now invite Minister Beckles and then Dr. Peart to please respond to our first question, that is looking at challenges and opportunities to the feminist movements and what are the steps that the stakeholders can do to address those challenges. As I mentioned earlier, it would be great, Minister Beckles, if you can also respond to some of the points raised by the previous panelists. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anisha. And again, to join my colleagues in saying what a pleasure it is to participate in this Generation Equality Forum. And I mean, I think the first thing I want to focus on is the importance of the feminist movement, civil society, the NGOs in setting the political agenda and in pressuring governments as it relates to influencing policy. We recognize, of course, that these organizations bring citizens' concerns to governments, to organizations, and monitor policies. And I think that all the speakers before me spoke about the importance of the issues of solidarity and the opportunities, the issue of dialoguing in spaces. And I think one of the things we probably don't focus enough on is the whole issue of educating not just the feminist movement, but globally about the role of the movement. Sometimes we get the impression that when we talk about feminism, people are not absolutely clear on what you're speaking about. And that sometimes influences the reaction that persons in the feminist movement would obtain. And I think when I listen to all the contributions tonight, I think, and in some instances in mourning for my sister in Sri Lanka, how can we address that issue of educating, persons all over the world about exactly what is the role of the feminist movement. Now, talking a little bit about the challenges, I think most of the speakers talked about the issue of funding, because sometimes the nature of the role and function and of some of the objectives that the feminist movement is involved in actually would restrict them in some instances in obtaining funding. So how do we address that issue of that bias that exists at times that denies the feminist movement and the NGOs access to funding? Very often the issue of capacity building, research, data collection that would put the NGO movement and the feminist movement in a much better position to be able to articulate, to debate, to negotiate for the laws and the various pieces of legislation that are very important. I think that is one of the areas that we should look at. And the other issue is that of traveling sometimes to the multiplicity of whether it's big conferences and meetings where very critical decisions are taking place, that a number of the feminist movement, the women's movement, the NGOs are not able to attend those meetings. And therefore that brings me to the issue now of the opportunities. I mean, many of us may not have liked the issue of having virtual meetings, but we are seeing the benefits. So how are we going to use technology to advance the agenda of the women's movement? Because I think it actually is going to give us that dialoguing spaces that we talked about. It can actually bring us closer together, solidarity. We can understand a little more about biases and issues. And finally, in terms of recommendation, is the issue of legislation. How do we look at equal opportunity legislation? How do we look at what the constitution in various countries include? Freedom of movement, right to religious belief, right to cultural beliefs. I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Beckles. And over to you, Dr. Peart.
All right, so feminists around the world, organizers of the Gender Equality Forum, and my esteemed sister panelists, I greet you with love and the warmth from Jamaica. So first and foremost, I've made some notes of what have been said earlier, and like my sisters, I agree that more networks are needed across the globe, where the feminist movement are more a network where each player understands what the other player is doing in the other region. And I would also like to know too that while women on the outside, the feminist movement has been very critical in setting the policy agenda, what you find to some extent, women who are inside the representational aspect of politics, there needs to be ways to more meaningfully engage these women to bring their views at the top of the policy agenda. And so, but overall, listening to all of you tonight, I think there is one issue that I, through my presentation in this panel, need to highlight, and it looks at this idea of the feminist movement being fragmented, the feminist movement being too dynamic. And I will state tonight that we owe it to no institution or ideology to be cohesive when the objective of our movement is to be, the objective of our movement is to dismantle a multifaceted system such as patriarchy that highlights itself in many different ways, circumstances, and situations. And so it is my view that the dynamism, the fragmentation that exists in the feminist movement
is one that is in our favor, and we should ensure that we own it. It becomes a movement where all views can contend, providing that the views have the overarching theme of equality for women and girls. Now, in the context of the Caribbean, our region, though small, it is filled with different cultures, faiths, and geographies. And I think that it is critical for us to understand that our own version of feminism in the Caribbean, it continues to be defined, redefined, and pushed in a way to resist the colonial legacies and dependencies that we have inherited. And so with my own experience from academia coming over into the feminist movement and into political activism, one of the experiences that I've had is that as a young woman, I find that when an individual believes in the ideas promoted by feminism, they cannot identify with these principles. And it goes back to what Honorable Beckles just spoke about, this miseducation of what feminism entails. And because they cannot identify with those, why they cannot identify with those principles, sorry, there is some amount of suspicion from one end of the spectrum, and there is some amount of unreal expectations on the other end. And so this idea to bring about equality, it brings this double-edged sword that is deeply problematic for those who wish to be involved in the feminist space as well as the political space. But what I have learned is that the feminist movement needs individuals who are middle-grounded, individuals who understand the mainstream politics, individuals who understand to be in the middle of mainstream politics and the feminist advocacy. And so as a movement, we have to understand that while change is gradual and going inside a movement where men and women execute patriarchy, which is something we also have to come to some peace with to work to dismantle, our own advocacy inside politics cannot look the same way as it does in the feminist world. Therefore, while we need a state that does not depoliticize the feminist movement, the feminist movement has to understand the rigors of political activism outside of feminism. Now, what are some practical steps?
Sorry, Dr. Peart, the time's up. I'm so sorry for this.
Okay, and I can give the recommendations or I can't?
You can add them to the closing comments, yes.
Okay, all right.
I'll give that to you. Thank you. Again, I'm so sorry. Many apologies to all the panelists. We do have a very tight time schedule. So thank you so much to everyone for answering our first couple of questions. We will now actually go towards the closing comments, and that is the last question for the day. And if you'd like, you can also, if you are unable to finish the first response, you can add the recommendations bit to this part. Unfortunately, we won't have much time for this. We have not more than 2 minutes per panelist for this question. The question is, in your experience, what good practices and actions can be shared to build a transformative change in society and propel feminist movements to the construction of a new world? So it's slightly at the broader level, but please do add your recommendations from the first question. For this question, I would first like to invite Minister Beckles, followed by Dr. Peart. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Anisha. I mean, very quickly for me, in terms of good practices, I would again talk about how can we share experiences in various countries, particularly as it relates to legislation and constitution. For example, Equal Opportunity Commission, I think it's very important. What does your constitution say about freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of cultures? And I mean, having been president of UN Women and having served at the United Nations, I have seen where the feminist movement, the NGOs, civil society, they are actually getting the opportunities to talk a lot more now on very important topics, and how to utilize UN bodies such as UN Women, UN ECLAC, and others who understand the role of the feminist movement. How can our sisters all over the world utilize the opportunity that is there to benefit from that wealth of experience you have at UN Women at UN ECLAC, and the technology that I spoke about earlier. How do we maintain the relationships, ensure the solidarity? And as my sister said from Jamaica, how do we ensure that education about what the feminist movement really is about and how it benefits society overall? How can we ensure that actually happens? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Beckles. Dr. Peart?
All right, so just to add two of the recommendations that I was going to give earlier, I think that we have to do, going forward, we have to do more of sharing of experience, particularly in areas of how governments, how states have moved from avoidance of responsibility on the parts of victims of violence to accepting that there are intersectional realities that enable the agency of victims. Also, there are some good practices from Jamaica that we could share with the international world concerning our Gender Advisory Council, our coordinated action plan to eradicate violence against women. In terms of actual practical steps that can be taken, yes, there is the need for capacity building where female representatives are concerned, but international partners need to make it practical where they take projects that specifically target female political constituencies. That way it becomes very meaningful for women to go into politics, particularly at a time like COVID, where there is limited funds for corporate social responsibility.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peart. I'd like to now invite Kumi and Virginia, please, for your closing comments. You both have 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. I think in the face of the pushback and restrictions and heightened security and militarization in the South Asia region, we again see hope in the courageous mobilizations and resilience and persistence at the local level in, for example, the mobilizations against the military coup in Myanmar. We see too in the persistence of family members who disappeared in Sri Lanka seeking truth and justice. We see it in women's refusal to bear the burden of microfinance loans again here in Sri Lanka and the huge farm mobilizations across the subcontinent. We also see youth engagement in environmental issues and a really strong reaction of the state against this. And much of this is led by women, by feminists in the face of threat. We also see feminists theorizing differently now, as Dawn did, not merely, say, for example, on violence against women in conflict, but we also theorized on the political economy of violence against women, both in conflict and in war. We see work done on public-private partnerships as states abdicate their responsibilities to the private sector. We are now working in Sri Lanka, for example, calling for the recognition of and valuing of unpaid care work and to understand how women perceive and resist violent extremism in all its manifestations. Again, a huge problem in the South Asia region. Feminist movements now work intersectionally and demand structural change, not merely equality or reformist demands. And this, I think, is a very interesting, important move in feminist theorizing and practice as we move beyond the limits of the politics of reform to the politics of refusal. Feminists are also creatively using new strategies for mobilizing both online and offline, despite the serious threats inherent in both spaces. We are learning from each other, we're sharing knowledge, we are enhancing solidarity, and we are back at oppositional politics, pushing to defend and protect rights won by feminist movements in our region and across the globe. And I think this is the immense hope we have for the future.
Thank you, Kumi. Virginia?
¿Me toca? Ya, rápidamente. Muchas gracias. todo tan interesante. Tengo tres que quiero dejar. Creo que lo primero es que es fundamental, y como hemos visto aquí también, la riqueza de las múltiples estrategias que tenemos. Tenemos estrategias frente ¿aló? Tenemos estrategias frente al Estado y son importantes y hay que seguirlas haciendo. Acá en Perú acabamos de aprobar en plena pandemia paridad y alternancia, ley de acoso político y de identidad de género posiblemente. Bueno, pero al mismo tiempo hay estrategias contraculturales que no podemos dejar. O sea, creo de que nuestro movimiento contestatario y transgresor tiene que estar evidenciándolo en sus agendas, ¿no? O sea, porque si no, la posibilidad de recuperar derechos sexuales y reproductivos, decisión del cuerpo, recuperar, luchar contra el racismo, por ejemplo, a nivel de la cultura, no sería, ¿no? Bueno, lo segundo, que es nuestro movimiento feminista, me parece que en general es parte de un movimiento mucho más amplio de justicia social, porque los temas de la justicia social, económica, política, racial, lo tenemos las mujeres. Entonces, no podemos estar fuera de eso, y de ahí creo que nos viene la fuerza fundamental para también este tipo de alianzas lo más amplias posible, sabiendo de que nuestra agenda sola, si no estén estas conexiones, simplemente no la cumplen solamente un grupo de mujeres. Y lo tercero, rápidamente, la diversidad es nuestra riqueza, sin duda, y cada vez lo estamos logrando más. Sin embargo, la diversidad en nuestros países está teñida de desigualdad y de diferencias entre nosotras, las mujeres, ¿no? Y entonces, esa es una dimensión simplemente a considerar para ver cómo deconstruimos las diferencias de poder y comenzamos, como dicen las mujeres zapatistas, a caminar parejo también entre nosotras. Ah, y quiero contarles de que en América Latina acaba de aprobar la CEPAL, una cosa por la que estamos luchando hace tiempo, que es el Fondo Regional de Apoyo a los movimientos feministas. Y eso está en la CEPAL, está aprobado para las agencias, los gobiernos, etcétera, etcétera. Es una estrategia interesante, la podemos obviamente compartir, difundir, porque ha sido una lucha como de unos cuantos años y se ha logrado. ¿Tengo más tiempo? Anisha?
You're almost done. You're done.
Oh, no, pero yo pensé de que ya estaba de antes. Ok, está bien. Ok. Corrí.
We will come back.
Corrí. Yeah.
Virginia, I will come back to you during the Q&A. All right. Thank you so much. Leila?
Yes, thank you, Anisha. So we really have an opportunity to create new systems, modalities, and partnerships to really resource the feminist and democratic agendas, the solidarity, the sharing and learning of experience that all of our speakers have spoken about. And some groups are already doing that. So select governments are creating feminist foreign assistance policies that commit to different levels and types of funding, and funding getting directly to women's organizations and feminist movements at the local level. And we need more of these. We also know that key private sector philanthropists have committed to addressing colonialism, racism, and sexism in their practices and engaging in more participatory, community-centered philanthropy. And we need to hold these private sector philanthropists accountable and demand more of that. There are diverse funding mechanisms that exist, including working through Prospera, the network of 44 women's funds that has an incredible reach across the globe and is able to get flexible funding to feminist organizations and movements, and to really the diversity of feminist movements that exist, groups that are registered or not, groups that are working online or offline. There's really a diversity of movements that need approaches. We see in the Action Coalition mentioned that there are new opportunities for private-public partnerships and bringing more stakeholders on board to say, how are you committed to gender justice? How are you committed to feminist movements? And to make sure that we have new partnerships and other people who are committed to this. We also know that some funders have created pooled funds. So pooled funds bring together more resources that can support some of the intersectional approaches that Kumi and others mentioned, that is about funding groups working at the systemic level and focusing on structural change, not just funding themes or funding silos, but really funding the rich diversity of feminist and gender justice movements that demand and deserve support.
Thank you so much, Leila.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to come to María and Alejandra for your closing comments. Thank you.
Bueno, muy bien, desde mi experiencia, creo que las acciones de calle son un claro ejemplo de las buenas prácticas que tienen los movimientos feministas. El tejer redes, el de unir nuestras voces, como ya lo mencionaban, el de unir nuestra fuerza, actitud, energía, y así poder impulsar acciones grandes que aporten a la construcción y transformación del nuevo mundo. En cuanto a acciones para construir un cambio transformador, considero que la principal es la formación de las presentes y nuevas generaciones más conscientes de la realidad y empoderadas de sus derechos, para que sigan promoviendo la lucha por la igualdad y que así, cuando ocupen espacios de toma de decisión, sean líderes y lideresas y autoridades con una mirada encaminada a la igualdad. Yo soy parte del Parlamento Guatemalteco para la Niñez, Adolescencia y Juventud, que trabaja en espacios de participación e incidencia para niñez, adolescencia y juventud, y este proceso que he llevado ya durante 9 años me ha permitido a mí y además niñas de toda Guatemala a desarrollarse como líderes de sus comunidades, de nuestras comunidades y del país, y ahora estar en espacios como el Foro de Generación e Igualdad, por lo que es necesario apostarle a la niñez, adolescencia y a las jóvenes, ya que el Estado tiene una gran deuda con nosotros. Y bueno, es necesario lograr que el movimiento feminista sea más cohesionado y al mismo tiempo pues, que se considere las diversas demandas que tienen las mujeres. ¿Y esto cómo? En una palabra, articulando. Es decir, crear y tejer redes para que todas las feministas puedan aplicar el conocimiento de su labor y realizarlo en distintos contextos.
Bien, muchas gracias. Yo coincido efectivamente con varias de las estrategias que han mencionado anteriormente, lo importante de las estrategias, digamos, múltiples de incidencia, de denuncia y de movilización articulada. Creo que es necesario, pues, seguir, ¿verdad? Seguir luchando de manera organizada frente a los fundamentalismos, frente al sexismo, frente a la homo, lesbo, transfobia, ¿verdad? Ponerle un alto también a esos discursos que muchas veces son discursos que discriminan incluso a compañeras cercanas, ¿verdad? De los movimientos, por ejemplo, estos movimientos transfóbicos también, y esos discursos, creo que frente al colonialismo, frente al racismo, frente al capitalismo y frente al extractivismo y militarismo, es importante que sigamos articulando estas luchas, sin olvidar que debemos cuidarnos, sin olvidar que es importante documentar el impacto que tienen las luchas y la violencia que también acuerpamos desde los movimientos feministas, entendiendo la diversidad del movimiento, de los movimientos. Una de las cosas importantes que hemos también venido viendo desde la Iniciativa Mesoamericana de Defensoras es la documentación del impacto de esa violencia. Hemos documentado que en los últimos 3 años, al menos 45 defensoras en Mesoamérica han sido asesinadas precisamente por estos contextos de violencia en los cuales desarrollan su labor. Por eso para nosotras es importante mantenernos comunicadas, mantenernos en red, pero sobre todo también recuperar los saberes de los cuidados colectivos y comunitarios de protección. Para nosotras también es importante acuerparnos, cuidarnos entre nosotras y hoy más que nunca afirmar que la protección integral feminista es necesaria, es posible, y hoy más que nunca es importante que desde los distintos espacios también le apostemos a cuidar a las defensoras, a denunciar la violencia que enfrentan las defensoras, que enfrentan las mujeres feministas en todos los espacios. Para nosotras es también importante hablar no solamente desde una perspectiva, digamos, colectiva, sino también individual, de la perspectiva de cuidar nuestra salud y también sanar juntas, ¿verdad? Colectivamente. Para nosotras es importante, sobre todo, construir estos espacios que nos permitan el autocuidado, el cuidado colectivo, y es importante que desde los distintos espacios de alianzas y articulación también se incorporen, por ejemplo, en las marchas, las comisiones de cuidado colectivo para acuerparnos, para cuidarnos, en las distintas acciones. Y como decían algunas compañeras que me antecedieron, reconocer lo importante que es cada una en los distintos espacios en los que está, ¿verdad? Cada una lo que puede aportar, cada una lo que puede brindar a esta alianza, a esta gran alianza del movimiento feminista a nivel global. Y creo que eso es sumamente importante. Muchas gracias por este espacio de diálogo, muy enriquecedor y de mucho aprendizaje.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. And once again, thank you so much to all our panelists. We're just receiving some questions, which I will share with you. In the meanwhile, I do request everyone who's attending, please do use the chat feature and send us your questions. We will try responding to as many as possible. So the first question that I have for the panelists is how to strengthen feminist movements in the COVID-19 context. What role does technology have in this process? It's from Tomasa Ravines. And it would be great if anyone who would like to respond can please go ahead, though I would specifically request Minister Beckles, because you also spoke about technology, if you can also address this question, especially how we can make technology more inclusive, and Leila as well, and anyone else who would like to take this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I spoke a lot about technology, mainly because it allows us an opportunity that we traditionally did not have. I mean, COVID has introduced some opportunities that, I mean, it may have been there, but in a sense, it has forced us to communicate. It has forced us to be creative. It is also allowing us to develop some networking skills and some relationships that we traditionally did not have. I mean, the extent to which we use the technology that is here, recognizing, of course, that when you do the data, there are still a lot of women and girls who don't have access to basic methods of communication. So we must, of course, link that with the issue of funding that was raised a while ago during the panel, the issue of private sector partnership and relationships, and how can we convince the funders about the importance of women and technology, women and internet, because it's also related to the issue of education and the advancement of women and girls.
I can just jump in quickly, Anisha.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So I would say that technology both has a liberatory aspect and can be used to harm the movements that are advancing feminist change. And so through COVID-19, we've seen that groups are launching apps to address gender-based violence. They're creating spaces for online convening. They're building safe and inclusive digital networks and communities. And at the same time, feminist movements are facing unprecedented levels of online harassment, cyber attacks, digital surveillance, and censorship as they organize and advocate online. And so I think we need to balance both of those and think about how we use technologies and feminist design platforms and tools to further the work that we do. And at Global Fund for Women, we're really fortunate to be partnering with the New Moon Fund, and other funds are also partnering with them. It is a feminist tech fund led by and for feminists from the Global South to advance feminist development of platforms, tools, and capacity to advance our use of technology and to protect ourselves from the harms of how technology is being used against us. We're also a lead just on the Action Coalition, and so there are some interesting also commitments being made there on the Action Coalition on Technology and Innovation.
Thank you so much, Leila. Kumi,
Yes, Anisha, thank you very much for both your responses. I really appreciate the fact that we do have the connectivity of the internet and the use of technology to understand what's happening globally, to learn from each other's experiences and strategizing. But I also see a real rise in the use of technology, particularly for surveillance by states. And I would really request funding women's funds to help the movement to understand the need for securing themselves from these threats, to understand how they can protect themselves. I think we need the training and the know-how on this, which we really, really lack. And this is something that needs to be supported, particularly by the funds.
Thank you so much, Kumi. Would anyone else like to address this question? All right.
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay, so just adding to what my colleagues have said, one good thing about the technology of our time, in particularly relating to the feminist movement, is that it has allowed for the movement to document violence and how it particularly targets women in ways that we would not have known before. And so what we have seen are some real qualitative evidence of the unique violence that women face. While that is one of the pluses of the technology time that we're living in, we do know that one of the good things that will result from this post-COVID-19 situation is that it will bring women more into global discussion at a cheaper rate, as was said earlier. And it has also brought negative implications for women and their well-being, because in countries where the digital divide is so wide, for women to access this kind of communication, access information relating to funding opportunities, they are opened up to new types of vulnerabilities. You're looking at sexual harassment, you're looking at other very serious types of sexual violations. So it's a double-edged sword in that we have been able to capture our stories in real ways. I can know about my sister in Sri Lanka and the unique violence that she faces. Likewise, she can know about me, but at the same time, there are some pitfalls that we have to prepare for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peart. And our next question is, how can we better support girl-led organizations and coalitions, given that they face additional barriers to receiving funding and getting access to policy spaces? So, for example, due to donors believing that they don't have sufficient experience or a proven track record, due to age bias, due to lack of child-friendly participatory mechanisms, etc. The question comes from Emily Heimsmoth of Save the Children. And actually, Dr. Peart, it would be great if you, Maria, and Alejandra can also respond to this question specifically. But again, this is open to all the panelists.
I'm sorry, please repeat the question.
Sure. How can we better support girl-led organizations and coalitions, given that they face additional barriers to receiving funding and getting access to policy spaces?
All right. So if I may, sorry about that. How can we support girls-led movement, mobilization, so to speak? I did speak earlier about the idea that capacity building is very important. Yes, building the soft skills of women who are aspiring leaders is very good. But at the same time, we have to create an enabling opportunity, an enabling space for women who are in representational politics. I believe that for us to encourage more young girls, more young women to get into the space, donors have to put some amount of targeting on female-led constituencies. It has always been something that I've been very passionate about. Yes, when the projects come, they have certain requirements that every constituency benefits from. But I think because of the hurdles that women have to cross when they get into politics and the hurdles that they have to continue to cross when they are in politics, I think that projects from an international space should zone in on them. And this would bring a better chance, this would give an added opportunity for young girls to get up in their own movements. I also think that where our young girls are concerned, there is never enough opportunity for mentorship. And there's also the idea that some of these projects that our international friends are presenting to community-based organizations as women-led opportunities for development, they also have to tailor the specific realities of some of these women who are in the community groups. Because what you find is that a lot of the financing that comes from the project is spent in securing experts to come and write these projects so that they meet the criteria for these projects that they're coming with. So I think that we have to be more practical and meet women and girls at their level that they're at.
Thank you, Dr. Peart. Maria, you had your hand raised.
Sí, respecto a cómo poder apoyar a las niñas, como mencionaba, yo soy parte de una organización de niñas y de adolescentes. El proceso, como bien lo menciona la compañera, es difícil, debido a que no creen en las capacidades que los niños que tienen, sus voces no son tomadas en cuenta. Sin embargo, creo que nosotras, como mujeres, como jóvenes, lo que podemos hacer es el acompañamiento y el asesoramiento. Tal cual es parte de ese proceso que tiene mi organización, el de que nosotros fuimos formados y ya al momento de poder ser jóvenes, nosotros seguimos acompañando a los demás niños, a las nuevas generaciones. Y también creo que es importante los diálogos intergeneracionales, igual que los encuentros intergeneracionales, porque de esta manera podemos articular, el de poder aprender, el de compartir ideas, experiencias, formas de trabajo, y de esta manera las niñas deben de saber de que no están solas, de que esta lucha es colectiva de todas las mujeres.
Thank you, Maria. Anyone else would like to?
Can I jump in just quickly, Anisha?
Leila, please go ahead.
Just quickly, I do think that as funders, we need to think about eligibility criteria, metrics for success, implicit bias that is about funding adult women-led organizations and movements. One way we've done that at Global Fund for Women is that we launched a call for an Adolescent Girls Advisory Council, and we have 12 adolescent girls ages 11 to 17 informing our work about how we can better serve girl-led, girl-centered, and girl-inclusive movements. And it really means doing the analysis of who you're funding and why we tend to lean towards adult women organizations and movements, and thinking about how we do that, how we ensure that we're not doing any harm, that we have safeguarding policies, that we are respecting the needs and realities of adolescent girls, but also really acknowledging their incredible leadership and analysis and organizing abilities. I mean, it's just incredible to see what adolescent girls are doing and young women across the globe today. And I also just want to reiterate the intergenerational focus is so important, because this work takes lifetimes. And we're building on our foremothers and also building spaces for our daughters. And the intergenerational is key to the work that we have in front of us.
Thank you, Leila. Anyone else? All right. We will then just move on to the next.
Solamente agregar.
Sure, go ahead.
Sí, era justamente en el sentido de la importancia de ir reconociendo que se van sumando nuevos retos con todo lo que implican las tecnologías, pero también teniendo en cuenta de las brechas digitales a las que se enfrentan muchas mujeres, muchas niñas, mucha población con la que trabajamos en los distintos procesos en nuestros países. Porque es una realidad, y con esto de la pandemia lo hemos visto, trasladar talleres, procesos formativos a lo virtual o el acoso, la violencia digital que ya se mencionaba anteriormente, ha implicado también tomar medidas para proteger, para cuidar desde nuestro cuerpo digital, ¿verdad? También de esos ataques, ese acoso y esa violencia. Entonces creo que una de las cosas importantes tiene que ver con eso, con invertir también en estos nuevos desafíos, en estas nuevas violencias y también pensar en procesos de intercambio. Me parece que la perspectiva intergeneracional es importante, pero también poder pensar en espacios de intercambio con otros países que tienen avanzados mecanismos de protección de la información privada de las personas, porque lo que nos hemos enfrentado es que en la pandemia nuestros estados están tomando medidas de vigilancia de la población y eso implica también mucha vigilancia de quienes ejercen la labor periodística y la labor de defensa de derechos humanos. Entonces no es posible que en nombre de la salud, en nombre de la protección de la vida, se vulneren otra serie de derechos, incluido el derecho a la libertad de expresión y el derecho a la defensa de derechos humanos por parte del movimiento feminista, del movimiento LGTBI y de cualquier voz que se considere disidente o crítica de los gobiernos actuales.
Anisha, if I may, just a short insertion.
Sorry, is that Dr.
Yes.
Yes, please. Okay, sure.
All right. So one of the things that I've found is that for us to discuss how to strengthen the capacity of young girls, it's almost as if we have to struggle to ensure that the conversation remains sanitized, the conversation remains polite, the conversation remains fit for public consumption. And in an era where the generations are at two ends, you have the younger set where they discuss every and anything online. And the generation before, they're making decisions about the young people now. I find that even though there are so many data there to tell us that young girls are being violated in ways that are not so polite, there is still an effort to have polite conversations regarding the care and protection of girls. So I think one of the ways that we can build the capacity of our young girls is to have an understanding that to really sensitize them on what equality looks like and what inequality looks like, we have to get out of our comfort zones and have conversations that are also not considered to be polite.
Thank you, Dr. Peart. I will now go over to our third question. We actually have around 15 minutes left for the panel. And I think on this question, it would be great if everyone can respond to this if possible. And the question is, how do we get from rhetoric to action? Any strong accountability practices in your region to ensure that governments will implement commitments that are outlined in action coalitions? Once again, I'll repeat the question. How do we go from rhetoric to action? Any strong accountability practices in your region to ensure that governments will implement commitments that are outlined in the action coalitions? Virginia, would you like to start?
¿Aló? ¿Sí? Sí, gracias. Mira, yo creo que hay una serie de mecanismos que tienen que, por supuesto, profundizarse más, que han servido accountability a los gobiernos nuestros, que generalmente son muy poco transparentes, ¿no? Una de ellas ha sido siempre los reportes sombra, ¿no? Que creo que eso ha sido algo como importante, pero también la movilización. En el último periodo creo que ha sido absolutamente increíble la forma en que ha habido las movilizaciones masivas en las calles en defensa de la democracia, por las luchas de las mujeres por los derechos sexuales y reproductivos y el aborto, por lograr un referéndum bueno, estoy hablando de varios países, Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, Perú, En fin, y en Centroamérica ha habido muchas movilizaciones también y muy reprimidas. Entonces hay una dimensión ahí que creo que es importante. Hay movilización democrática una de cuyas exigencias es generalmente la rendición de cuentas de conductas poco democráticas, indudablemente. Y luego los mecanismos con los cuales tenemos que seguir coordinando a nivel de la región. La otra dimensión que yo sí quisiera recuperar a partir de las cosas que estaban diciendo antes los compañeros, es que esta recuperación de la memoria, creo que es fundamental. O sea, yo tengo 75 años y yo he visto en los procesos nuestros cómo han ido, y no saben la emoción que significa para mí la cantidad enorme de mujeres jóvenes que hay y que están en las calles y que se mueven y que hablan y que piden y que luchan y expanden la agenda. O sea, realmente es maravilloso, pero esas historias tienen que quedar junto con las historias de las otras nuestras. O sea, esta guerra que hay de los gobiernos nuestros contra las defensoras de derechos humanos y de los grupos neofascistas que comienzan a desarrollar ahora es muy grave. Nosotras tenemos muchas, como dice la compañera, digo solamente dos, o sea, Berta Cáceres en Honduras, asesinada y hasta el día de hoy no se sabe. Y Marielle Franco, asesinada recién hace 2, 3 años en Brasil, ¿no? Bueno, en todo caso, creo de que lo que me interesa es ver cómo le recuperamos desde nuestras diferentes miradas y regiones, además, cómo han ido ampliándose las agendas, como por ejemplo la lucha contra el racismo, que en nuestro periodo no estaba del todo, pues está colocada en este momento al centro. Y así por el estilo, qué es lo que en este momento es importante para lograr una articulación de cambio. No necesariamente la unidad, porque la unidad siempre deja a alguien afuera, digo yo. Mejor nos articulamos y de ahí vamos andando, ¿no? Esa es lo que y en eso, por ejemplo, sí tenemos posibilidades de hacer conexiones con las personas, las feministas que están en el Estado, que están en algunos países y hacen un trabajo bastante interesante, o con gobiernos que sean un poco más democráticos que muchos de los nuestros, ¿no? Digo, eso, nada más.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Kumi, did you have your...
Yes, for us, the question of how to hold the state accountable is really important. Working through 30 years of conflict, I remember in the early days of conflict, we used UN mechanisms and quite effectively because we had no other recourse at the national level. I think it's time again to look at how we can use the special procedures of the UN, the treaty bodies, particularly if we want to hold governments accountable for the commitments of the action coalitions, for example. The only way they can be held accountable, to my mind, is through their obligations with the treaty bodies. So we need to try to incorporate some of these recommendations into our reporting to treaty bodies, to the special rapporteurs, to the special procedures, and that they in turn can try to hold our states accountable. The other issue, though, as important, is to see how we can mobilize at the national level to hold states accountable using, say, our national human rights mechanisms, our women's machinery. But in times when states are not responsive to national pressures, whether there is a possibility of building regional solidarities and global solidarities, of course. And finally, I think as Virginia said, we have the responsibility to document what's happening, to ensure that we have a record of particularly of violations by state and non-state actors in times where we can't hold them accountable. for times when we may be able to hold them accountable in the future. So that kind of documentation, I think, is also very, very important. But how to strengthen multilateral institutions is, I think, a very important piece of work that we as feminists and activists need to do.
Thank you, Kumi. Alejandra, I think you also had your hand raised. Anyone else? I think Alejandra's frozen. Yes, Leila, I see you.
Just very quickly, I think Kumi said it well in terms of the UN and the special procedures. I do think that we need commitments to financing across all of the action coalitions. So right now it is primarily in the action coalition around feminist leadership and movements, which is a very important space for it to be. But across all of the action coalitions, I think that we need clear commitments about more and better funding and how resources are getting specifically to feminist organizations and movements, women human rights defenders, et cetera, and that we do need accountability mechanisms at the different levels. It is government, but it's also private sector because they are also making commitments. So what those accountability mechanisms will look like will be key to the success of the action coalitions and the Generation Equality Forum. I also think the work that's been done around community accountability and how we as feminist funds and women's funds are accountable to the movements and communities we serve is really important and a piece of the accountability puzzle as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila. We have a couple of minutes left before we wrap up. Anyone else would like to respond to that question?
All right, just an addition here that there are many ways that accountability can occur. You have at the funding level, you have at the community group level with their governance structure and all, but there is also the unique time that we're living in. And because I work with a lot of young people, I tend to think about their issues when I come to the table. And so where accountability is concerned, we also have to understand how cyberspace has been enabling the accountability that persons in the feminist movement can have. We also have to understand how this digital era has redistributed power in society somewhat, because there are ways in which in times gone by, we could not have recorded an atrocity and would have gotten real-time response from the state. And we have seen where the digital era has facilitated that. So for us to have that kind of accountability, I think the feminist movement, I think young girls, I think women have to be prepared to understand how to navigate the cyberspace. They have to be able to understand how to use the technological gadgets to bring about their own agency. And they have to be able to see themselves on this platform rather, lobbying for their own accountability. And while they're doing that, when they get the opportunity to sit on committees, to sit on councils, be it at the local level, be it at the national level, they have to make themselves available, because that is where it really matters. It cannot be done from outside. You have to get in where it matters.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peart. Minister Beckles, I saw you wanted to say something as well, so we'll take that as the last comment and then I will wrap up.
Yeah, just thanks again. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, the importance of familiarizing ourselves with the various processes, and so at the UN and at the many different bodies that are responsible for the accountability of which we speak. I must confess that, whilst at the UN, it's one of the, it's a steep learning curve. The extent to which you have colleagues who will help you, who have the institutional memory, it's important. And for NGOs and feminist organizations and civil societies who have the opportunity to attend these sessions, you can find yourself that the meetings can take a day, 2 days, and you appeared, you disappeared, and you really haven't had a clue as to what exactly took place. But at the same time, it's so important to follow the process, understand the process, to educate yourself if you want to make the kind of changes that we are talking about tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Beckles. We have the last few minutes left. So if you'll allow me to just wrap up this session, I want to thank my panelists first. Thank you so much for those really insightful discussions, conversations, and most importantly, doing all of that in a very, very tight time schedule. I think some really critical comments and recommendations have come out from this panel. We are looking at a scenario where post-pandemic issues around marginalizations and discriminations have not only increased, but have also changed. We're looking at different kinds of exclusion. We're looking at different kinds of violations. And one thing that COVID has definitely highlighted is that our current institutions and systems are failing or have failed miserably women, girls, trans, intersex people across the globe. So the time is now to hold the institutions accountable. And one of the key ways of doing that is investing in feminist movements who have been at the forefront of this fight for decades. I really loved, Virginia, what you said, and that is recapturing our memories, writing our stories, changing the narrative. And also when we look at unity, it is always leaving someone behind. So looking at intersectionality, looking at collaboration, looking at networking, and holding institutions accountable. I think accountability is something that is talked about quite often, but we need more practices, processes, and systems to ensure accountability at various levels, not only at the state level, but also at the level of funding. As Leila just highlighted, that even though a lot of resources are being committed, we have new foreign feminist policies, how much of that resources are actually going into the hands of feminist organizations. So not only do we need more resources, we need those resources directly in the hands of those who are leading the change agenda, the feminist organizations. And lastly, we need more young voices coming in, not only as a tick mark or at the participation level, but at the leadership level. Women and girls can no longer or we just can't continue treating them as a constituency, but it's about time that we're acknowledged as leaders who are changing the agenda. So at that note, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this very critical discussion. I know at different time zones, it must have been challenging, but thank you so much. And I hope that we take this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha, for great moderation as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, my sisters.
Really, Anisha, wonderful. Very nice.
Goodbye, Anisha.
So much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.